Essentially, the report sets out that sexual torture is a form of torture, which I call the ultimate imposition of power over another human being through sexual means. And these are described also in paragraphs 17, 21, and 22 of the report, including intrusions and aggressions against the intimate or private areas of a person. Now, I was asked recently about what that means in more detail. Of course, we're talking about sexual and reproductive organs, but we're talking about more than that. And it was left reasonably broad, following also the Istanbul Protocol and the latest update, which also includes areas around sexual torture, because a lot of sexual torture starts also with encroachments on one's personal space and may not involve the sexual or reproductive organs, but may be of a sexual character, either through verbal assaults or through unwanted touching and threatening and intimidating behaviour when one considers that this is within the context of a power relationship. Running in parallel, I guess, is the conflict-related sexual violence agenda and the women, peace and security agenda. And there's no intention to displace that at all, but I think there are advantages both for victims and survivors, but also investigators and prosecutors in more fully utilising the torture framework. Now, what is a bit strange about this is when we didn't have crimes of rape and sexual enslavement, etc., recognised, for example, that's now recognised in the Rome Statute, we were actually having to craft these types of assaults and aggressions through different means, and the torture prohibition and the torture frame was one of those. And then we were all very pleased when rape and sexual assault were all identified as specific crimes. And in a way, the pendulum maybe has swung too far the other way, and we've lost some of the advantages of framing these assaults and attacks as torture. There are, in the report, one of the most important things from my perspective is there's a call for action, and it's really to garner support and utilisation, and also just more thinking and discussion around how to make these areas compatible, but also so that ultimately the goal is that victims and survivors gets the support that they need, and that they are able to proceed to court if that is their wish, but also so that we can prevent this type of torture occurring. I also think there are a lot of good tools in the torture domain, and obviously a large network of practitioners working on these issues on an everyday basis anyway. So we don't want an artificial separation, but there will be times when the torture framework is particularly relevant and applicable. Also, I think this is an issue that is prevalent in almost all conflicts, and as conflicts are rising around the world, the ICRC last week reported to me that they've updated their statistics. No longer more than 100 conflicts around the world, they're now counting 120. It's a very dire situation, and the risks therefore of this type of violence are greater, coupled with the fact that modern wars often have more female soldiers, which also adds to the risks that they may face in that domain. One is that on the torture area, we have a robust binding torture framework or anti-torture framework. 174 states parties to the Convention Against Torture, which applies both in wartime and in peacetime. The definition in Article 1, I would say these days, is customary international law. There are no disputes about that. That's a solid description of both acts of torture, but also potential crimes of torture. Some variations if you're an international lawyer in relation to war crimes and crimes against humanity, but the essence of that definition of the infliction of severe pain or suffering for the purposes of doing things such as intimidating, oppressing, extracting information or a confession or discrimination remain at the core of that. And that framework, I venture to say in the report, is stronger than the framework we currently have on violence against women or gender-related violence. There is no statute of limitations, as you know, on crimes of torture, whereas in domestic laws, including military codes, there are often time limits of 3 or 6 years after which a victim and or survivor is not able to make their claim. No immunities and no amnesties are explicit, and the penalties are generally higher than those at domestic law for rape. So the convention, you know, says that these must attract the highest penalties to recognise the gravity of the offence of torture, which is a jus cogens and erga omnes violation. The second that I think is very useful to the inclusivity to the torture framework is its inclusivity. It's not a women and girls framework. It's not in the minds, even if rape and sexual violence is also not a women and girls framework, but has become almost associated with that. So it allows all victims to be able to, in my view, speak more freely about what has happened to them and not isolate the sexual violations with the other violations, which may be all part of a continuum. Not always, but in a lot of cases, it's kind of the escalation when other forms have, for example, failed to intimidate the prisoner, has failed to break their will, then they may move to these other considered more serious violations. The third area is shame, and the report spends some time in trying to shift the shame from victims to perpetrators, and that in a way is about the fact that there's no shame in being tortured. We don't talk really about shame and torture, yet we talk a lot about shame and sexual violence and sexual assaults and rape. And of course, all of the people in this group, I imagine, you know, the immorality of this crime is not on the victim. It is the immorality of the perpetrator. And we need to start really pointing the fingers and exposing that level of absurdity in how we talk about these crimes. So in a way, it avoids a victim who's able to express what has happened to them and have it classified as torture can avoid that shame. They can proudly say they are a victim of torture. They may be a victim of sexual torture, but they get to say they're a victim of torture. And and I think there are benefits, and I hear that from victims and survivors who don't want to be labelled as victims of rape, etc., would prefer to be part of the mainstream. And the fourth is around consent. All these very fraught arguments about, especially rape as a form of sexual torture, these questions about did the person consent or not. Well, in torture, we don't ask people whether the beatings they received at the hands of the military officer, they consented to them. We don't ask them whether, if they're hung up in the room, they consented to them. Why are we asking them about consent when this is all part of a continuum when sexual acts are at play? So in a way, both for victims and survivors, but also investigators and prosecutors, it may free them from some of these otherwise very tricky legal questions that also allow perpetrators to, in a way, distort what might be occurring in, say, other forms of rape within the context of torture, which is one of a coercive environment and an abuse of power relationship.
Torture is often spoken about and referred to as something that happens to men, that men are the main victims. If I, as a member of the CAT, asked states about torture and violence against women and girls, I was frequently told that they have their own conventions, CEDAW and CAT, meaning that they were not the main targets or the main to be discussed under the CAT. Of course, this has changed quite a bit, but still it's important to think that this is not ancient history. So what often falls outside the concrete work to denounce and stop torture is the massive torture that women are exposed to through rape, sexual harassment, and severe humiliation in armed conflict and war. And these violations, to me, meet the definition of torture, because when we're speaking about sexual violence and sexual torture or sexual abuse of women in the context of war, we are talking about intended pain and suffering, that's no doubt, with a purpose. So there is a purpose, and the purpose is to humiliate, to threaten, or to punish women. And it's often performed, most of the time, performed by a person in a public role, such as soldiers, police, or their associates. And the criteria for reasons of discrimination is very relevant also in this context. So the many attempts to keep these forms of serious human rights violations outside the discussion and work against torture is very wrong. I would like today to start with a story about my own attempt at obtaining funding and support for psychosocial work with women who had been exposed to sexual violence as part of war. In fact, I traveled to Geneva and spoke to people there. I was very interested in the possibilities of applying to the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture and others that might have wanted to support survivors of these kinds of severe violations. This was towards the end of the 1980s, so it's a long time ago, and I was involved in civil society organizations in situations of conflict. But what I was told in Geneva very clearly is that this form of violence, that is rape in war, could not be considered torture. It had always been a part of warfare, lamentable as it was, but as we now would have said it, it was collateral damage in war. It was not torture. Again, this was in the end of the 80s. So there was no support to be obtained for this. So I will now very briefly outline some of the historical background to what we are discussing today. First of all, how this form of violence, conflict-related sexual violence, finally became known for what it is, namely torture, crime against humanity, war crimes, and even ethnic cleansing. We know so well today that sexual violence in war and conflict before the 1990s was not registered or documented. It was severely underreported. It was not considered politically relevant, and in most cases, the perpetrators were never convicted. The survivors not given any form of remedy or redress, and there was hardly any research on the topic, and sexual and gender-based violence against women in war and conflict was not a part of the human rights agenda. But fortunately, with strong engagement from civil society organizations, in particular feminist groups, action and awareness about what was happening changed this situation. And this awakening and call for action was followed by treaty bodies in the UN, especially CEDAW and other UN bodies. Because it was with the wars and armed conflicts in Rwanda and in Bosnia, when the world finally recognized and acknowledged that rape had become a weapon of war, that things started happening. And we are now in the beginning of the 90s. So again, it was the reports of rape and other abuses against women in the armed conflicts in Rwanda, 1990 to 94, and former Yugoslavia from 91 to 95, that brought attention to the subject after such a long time. Seeing the issue as the closest to physical integrity issues and the kinds of violations already addressed by human rights bodies, and finding widespread agreement in all world regions about the prevalence of this form of abuse, NGOs made it the centerpiece of their advocacy aimed at the June 1993 World Conference on Human Rights. There, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action declared that abuses against women were an inalienable, integral, and indivisible part of universal human rights. And then investigations and resolutions saw the light of the day. The Security Council's Commission of Experts investigated violations of international humanitarian law in the former Yugoslavia and identified systematic sexual assault in its priority. This was in 1993. The Security Council's resolution identified from 1992, identified massive, organized and systematic detention and rape of women, in particular Muslim women, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as acts of unspeakable brutality, and urged for further investigation. The UN Commission of Human Rights, Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, concluded that the sexual violence served as instruments of ethnic cleansing in 1993. And again in 1993, the Statute of International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia included rape as a crime against humanity, as well as the crimes of torture and extermination. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda decided that rape constituted a war crime and a crime against humanity, and was the first international court to find an accused person guilty of rape as a crime of genocide. Finally, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 2002 included wartime sexual violence in its list of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and defined sexual violence as rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. As Navi Pillay, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said in 2014, victims of sexual violence bear the cost of the harm they suffered with dramatic physical, psychological, and material consequences, which destroy not only their lives, but often also the lives of their children. This creates irreparable damage to the very fabric of societies and in turn poses serious threats to the prospects of reconciliation and sustainable peace and development. I like this quote from Navi Pillay, so I frequently revert to this. But before she said these words, a lot of important steps were taken. First of all, in the UN, in particular in the Security Council, we saw a number of very important resolutions on this issue, starting of course with 1325, where for the first time women's security was considered relevant for international peace and security by the UN Security Council. Then follows 1820 from 2008, recognizing sexual violence in conflict as a weapon and tactic in war, and also war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we have the further ones laying ground for a special rapporteur on sexual violence in conflict. And we have one also later on talking about the root causes of sexual violence, and also referring to our brothers, because for the first time in 2016, there was also a referral to our brothers, meaning that also men and boys, not only women and children or girl children, are exposed to sexual violence in war and conflict. So what do we know about the numbers of sexual war crimes? We know from Bosnia that there are very high numbers, difficult to know exact. Some people say 20,000, others would say 50,000. We know that the estimates of Rwanda genocide sexual violence also range from 250,000 to 500 individuals. We know that more than 3/4 of Liberian women were raped during this country's civil war. And the Democratic Republic of Congo reports are tens of thousands of women raped during the conflict spanning for more than a decade from the mid-90s. We know also high numbers from the conflict in Colombia, and we will hear more about this today as well. And we know from Syria, we know from Sudan, especially Darfur, and now also lately the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And from the very beginning, there came serious reports on sexual violence against women, against men, and against children, and also elderly people by Russian soldiers shortly after the invasion. And the then general prosecutor in Ukraine, Irina Vendiktova, she expressed already some few days after the invasion itself that there were serious allegations already on sexual crimes against both men, boys, girls, and women, and that this has to be documented and investigated in order for one day justice to be done. Also, these crimes are investigated by other other society, civil society in Ukraine, among them Juryfem, which is the organization of lawyers. So again, we speak about ongoing crimes and the need to document and to investigate what is happening.
Entonces, en Colombia, la tortura sexual y basada en género pues, se ha visto tanto en el conflicto armado y en la protesta social. Nosotros consideramos que tortura sexual son todos aquellos actos que afectan y que van directamente hacia la parte biológica de la sexualidad. Y hacemos una diferenciación entre tortura sexual y tortura basada en género, aunque realmente comparten muchos aspectos juntos. Es como una unidad. Pero en la tortura basada en género se realizan estos actos inhumanos y degradantes con el fin de dañar o hacer uso de algún aspecto de la identidad de género. Entonces, consideramos que se presentan debido a una confluencia de factores que actúan de una forma interseccional, es decir, que están unos unidos junto a los otros, y que por supuesto está presente el patriarcado. En el patriarcado hay como unos intereses específicos hay un ejercicio de control social en la tortura, que ya lo han comentado también anteriormente las otras panelistas, y hay un uso de la fuerza desproporcional. Nosotros, como les comentaba antes, lastimosamente empezamos a ver cómo en el estallido social se empezaron a dar unos actos repetitivos en contra especialmente de mujeres, que llevaban a los sitios de detención inmediata que aquí se denominan CAI, y allá las sometían a desnudamiento forzado, a posturas sexuales forzadas, y esto fue sistemático en varios lugares, en varios CAIs que habían en Bogotá. Por eso sostenemos que, por supuesto, que también hay una sistematicidad. Y usualmente a las víctimas hacia quienes se dirige son personas que están en vulnerabilidad o que son disidentes políticos. En Colombia esta tortura ha sido ejercida por grupos armados, por la fuerza pública también. También la tortura tiene unas dimensiones, afecta, por supuesto, a la dimensión psicológica, afecta, por supuesto, el aspecto físico de las personas, la biología, el cuerpo de las personas, pero queremos también mencionar algunos elementos de cómo se afecta la dimensión psicosocial en este tipo de tortura, porque como pareciera que esa tortura se realiza en escenarios individuales, en donde se está un poco al amparo de la vista de los demás, como que no tuviese consecuencias para la comunidad. Como se generan estigmas hacia las víctimas, estigmas con respecto a que fueron torturados sexualmente, de pronto las personas no quieren hablar, ahí especialmente si son personas que se quieren tener un liderazgo y que quieren mantener un prestigio determinado. Estos estigmas llevan a que la comunidad o los rechace o no los acepte del todo. Acá puntualizar un poco qué hemos encontrado en Colombia con respecto a este tipo de tortura. Ha sido usado como arma de guerra y como castigo ejemplarizante para decirle a las personas no debes hacer ciertas cosas. Desafortunadamente, las mujeres han sido el grupo más victimizado. Aproximadamente de las personas que han mencionado que han tenido tortura sexual y tortura basada en género, son 90% aproximadamente las mujeres que han sido más victimizadas, y también la comunidad LGBTQI+. Se ha dado esclavitud sexual, se han dado violaciones colectivas, ha habido acoso sexual, ha habido obligación a presenciar actos sexuales, desnudez forzada. Estas son algunas de las más prevalentes situaciones que se han dado en el conflicto armado. Y en la protesta social, pues también vemos que de nuevo la prevalencia es mayor contra las mujeres, y esto pues porque también se considera en una norma patriarcal que el espacio público no es para las mujeres, y que tampoco el espacio de protesta social debería ser para las mujeres. En estos casos se ha podido documentar durante la protesta social que ha habido desnudamiento forzado, posturas físicas forzadas y tocamientos que lo ha realizado la fuerza pública. Ha habido violaciones sexuales y ha habido agresiones verbales que buscan el castigo por ser mujeres que protestan. Entonces creo que tenemos que expandir también nuestro foco de trabajo, no solamente a los espacios de detención o a la guerra, sino que también tenemos que pensar un poco que en la protesta social está ocurriendo este tipo de hechos. Varias dimensiones se pueden dañar con esto, solo que nosotros decimos que se afectan estas dimensiones físicas, psicológicas y psicosociales y que interactúan entre sí, y que al interactuar entre sí hacen que el daño sea mucho más prolongado, mucho más difícil de manejar. En lo físico, por supuesto que se afecta la sexualidad, la salud sexual y reproductiva. Pueden haber dolores crónicos, cambios corporales demasiado fuertes y dificultades en experimentar la sexualidad y placer luego de que se ha experimentado la tortura sexual. En el aspecto psicológico, algo que hemos visto muy recurrente son dificultades de autoestima y de autopercepción, dificultades en las relaciones interpersonales y, por supuesto, las afectivas se pueden llegar a afectar, y algunos efectos derivados de la ansiedad como insomnio, pesadillas, inestabilidad afectiva y fallas en la memoria, sobre todo cuando lo que tenga que ver con el recuerdo de los hechos de tortura sexual vividos. Pueden todos estos daños convertirse en un síndrome mucho más grave cuando ya podemos decir que se ha dado o ansiedad o depresión, porque estos síntomas prevalecen durante mucho tiempo, se mantienen durante mucho tiempo y pueden llegar a afectar de una manera bastante grave a las personas. En lo psicosocial, que también pensamos que interactúa con los otros, no lo consideramos como una categoría separada, pues se aumenta el estigma social, se rompe el tejido social, puede haber aislamiento y desconfianza, y también la afectación de liderazgos y la defensa de derechos humanos.
So today I'm going to talk to you about the work that we've been doing in the Syria context, working with male survivors of sexualized torture. As you know, the war has been going on for more than a decade. Synergy for Justice has been working in the context, or I have been working in the context since 2013, and we are partnered with a fantastic local Syrian-led organization called Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights. So we started our work there to build capacity for Syrian doctors to do forensic medical evaluations for torture and sexual violence. We knew that no one else was doing this in a really systematic way there, and that this would be important evidence to further accountability and to combat impunity. So we started, as I mentioned, back in 2013. We did the training, based on the Istanbul Protocol. Following that, we developed a standard form that we have worked on and refined over the years so that the doctors, would have a standardized form. And also, really importantly, it provides this huge, very rich set of quantitative data that we can use, which is, the sort of the foundation of the research that I'm going to talk to you about today. By earlier this year, we had done already more than 650 forensic medical evaluations there, and they all are documenting the physical, the psychological, and the sexualized torture as well. We were surprised, and increasingly surprised, to see how much sexualized torture was being used, not just against women, but about men as well. So we have also previously, we've reported on the use of sexualized torture against women in the Syrian context. But because our data set contains many more male cases, we decided to focus, and because it's, people are used to hearing about sexual violence and sexualized torture conducted or perpetrated against women, less so against men. But I think we're having to increasingly raise awareness that this is happening in a lot of places. So I'd like to share some of the key findings with you. So the first was that all of the men that we interviewed experienced multiple forms of physical, psychological, and sexualized torture. Many of them had prolonged detentions in different sites. Sometimes they were in one site for a while, let out for whatever reason, and then rearrested and tortured again in another site. So there's compounding harm of the different types of torture, and also the multiple detentions and the uncertainty of living in Syria over the past, more than a decade. I mean, decades, arguably. The common physical torture are the things that you all see, I think, in your work, being slapped, punched, kicked, hit. 60% of men reported that they were tortured with multiple devices, and 48% reported being burned or electrocuted. 80% reported suspension and forced positions. So that's the physical torture. In terms of sexualized torture, more than 97% reported that they endured forced nudity. More than 94% experienced verbal sexualized abuse. More than 45% experienced direct violence or trauma to the genitals or anus. More than 43% were forced to witness others who were being sexually abused and tortured. And almost 10% of men in our cohort reported rape. So during the detention, of course, there was near universal reporting that during detention there was acute pain, bleeding, skin infections, sleep disturbances, fear, sadness, anxiety. All of this, of course, was very prevalent, as the men reported it, very prevalent during detention. Over time, though, because we were interviewing many men who had been actually out of detention for several years already, ostensibly, they're safe, they're back in their communities, but the physical and psychological conditions continue, right? So many of the ones that remained were psychological, avoidance, intrusive memories, lack of trust, isolation, anger, low self-esteem. Many still had chronic pain from different conditions, and many were suffering from depression and anxiety for many years. There were a lot of important changes in the behavior, personality, and how they reported how they felt, not only how they felt, but how they interacted with their families. And of course, many of them are very aware too of how what impacted them is impacting their families as well. So in terms of some of the things that were more challenging for the men to talk about is that about more than a quarter of them reported erectile dysfunction and other kinds of challenges with intimacy, sexual relations, even with their wives and long-term partners. 71% reported a lack of knowledge of available support services, and almost 60% reported that they were too embarrassed to seek these services. So we know that angry, distrustful, isolated men also have like a lot of resulting physical risks as well. So substance abuse, cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and other kinds of premature death are very common in people who have these psychological feelings. It goes from the head to the body. We knew this anecdotally, or we knew it intuitively, I should say, but what we realized through the research is that the sexualized torture does have much more serious impacts for people. So there are several policy implications that I want to touch on briefly before we move on. Obviously, the critical importance of prevention. The Syrian conflict rages on. It's not our scope, perhaps, to work for, we're not in diplomacy or trying to end the war itself, but we really need to push hard on accountability, because that does seem to be one area where maybe we can make progress for Syria, and perhaps as a deterrent for other settings as well. We're also very concerned about the impacts on transitional justice for Syria because of this. These 4 negative symptoms that we saw increase over time: anger, lack of trust, self-isolation, and low self-esteem. These symptoms can be drivers of violence within families and communities. So this really can impact post-conflict peace building, reparation, and economic recovery when combined with poverty, forced displacement, and perceptions of injustice and neglect. These are recognized risk factors for radicalization and extremism, and really pose a lot of risks and uncertainty, I think, for a future Syria. The third point is about the radiating impacts amongst family and friends and community. So we want to ensure that people understand that anti-torture programming needs to focus not just on the survivors themselves, but also to recognize that the collective harm is there, and the collective harm also needs to be addressed. So, work through stigma has already been mentioned a couple of times, because I think it cannot be stressed enough how important stigma is and the role that it plays in preventing people from moving on, from seeking justice, from seeking health services, psychological care, and things like that. The following point is about the need for specialized services for men. So the men, as I mentioned earlier, many of them didn't know where services were, or they were too embarrassed to find the services. Probably we can imagine, because there aren't many specialized services that advertise themselves as, being there to support male survivors of sexualized torture. So we need to make sure that there's meaningful access to medical, psychological care, social and livelihood support,